Good afternoon. It's a great, well, it's not a pleasure. I think it would be bizarre to say that it was a pleasure to chair a discussion of genocide in Ukraine's history. Let me say that it's a privilege and an honor to be here in the Ukraine House. Let me pay tribute to Victor Pinchuk and everybody at his foundation for the extraordinary work that they've done. This exhibition is, for me, by far the most memorable thing about this year's World Economic Forum. And I'm very proud to be a part of the effort to raise awareness and also to maintain awareness of what is going on in Ukraine, not only amongst the kind of people who come to the World Economic Forum, but further through the media to the world as a whole. With that having been said, I'm going to introduce our two expert speakers. I, by the way, am Niall Ferguson. I'm a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. I claim no expertise on Ukrainian history, though I have written on the question of genocide in my book, The War of the World. But I'm here to moderate. My role is to ask more or less intelligent questions of the experts, and then to invite you later on in the course of this hour to put questions to them yourselves. To my left is Serhii Plokhii, professor of Ukrainian history at Harvard and also director of the Ukrainian Research Institute. He and I were colleagues, a happy time when I was also at Harvard. If you don't know Serhii's work, you are not well informed on the history of Ukraine. And of course, his range is much greater than the history of Ukraine. I'll mention a couple of his books. Atoms and Ashes, A Global History of Nuclear Disasters, which was published just last year. The Frontline Essays on Ukraine's Past and Present. He's won numerous awards, including the Bailey Gifford Prize and the Shevchenko National Prize, which he won in 2018. To his left, it's a privilege to introduce Borys Gudziak, the Metropolitan Archbishop of Philadelphia for Ukrainian Catholics in the United States and president of the Ukrainian Catholic University, also the founder of the Institute of Church History. He is the author of the Kiev Metropolis, the Constantinople Patriarchate, and Genesis of the Brest Union. Please welcome our two distinguished speakers with a round of applause. Let me begin with you, Serhii. I want to ask a question about genocide as a concept, because often I think when the word is used, many people think of the Nazi extermination camps, and they assume that genocide simply means the physical annihilation of a people. But that's not quite right, is it? That the term has a somewhat more subtle and broader meaning than that. Yes, indeed. Very, very often when people hear about genocide, they think about Holocaust, right? And genocide is a term that, again, certainly can include Holocaust, but it also has different dimensions. And if you Google right now genocide, probably what you will get at the very top would be a very short definition that genocide is intentional destruction of a group, ethnic or other group, with the purpose of alienating of a particular group or nation. And the question is intentional. And that's where many discussions and debates being held, including on the Yugoslavia, including on the Cambodian genocide, and so there are different definitions. And discussion about Ukrainian famine of 32-34 as a genocide or not genocide is very much focused on the issue of intentionality and very much focused on, okay, how many people died or didn't die. In real terms, or in terms of defining the genocide, that really doesn't mean much, the number per se. And the
person who defined the concept of genocide, who came up with that, Raphael Lemkin, who, again, the ideas partially came from his study at Lviv University, so he is not foreign to Ukraine per se. He was thinking about the famine, the Holodomor, as a genocide, but defining it not just as the killing or the death by hunger of so and so many people, millions, again, and millions. But he was thinking about that as a combination of a number of factors. The attack on the Ukrainian culture, liquidation of the Ukrainian churches in the early 1930s, the attack on the Ukrainian political elite at that time, that was already communist elite, and again, Skripnik is one of the representatives of it, and the destruction of the peasantry. So that didn't get it into the UN resolution, because UN resolution, it's like in that joke, what is a camel? This is a horse created by the committee. So someone was adding something, others were retracting, the Soviets were there certainly to make sure that the definition of the genocide can't be used against them. But if you look at what the father of the term genocide was thinking about again, one of the tragic episodes of Ukrainian history, of Holodomor in particular, he looked at that as a combination of factors. And again, cultural factors were an important part of that. And that's again, addressing the issue of the complexity of the term, relation of Ukraine to that term. But Ukraine, unfortunately, has not been a stranger to genocides in principle, again, defined in different terms, from the Holodomor of 32-33, looking at the Holocaust, where Ukraine is one of the principal killing fields of the Holocaust, with, again, anywhere between, again, at least every 10th person who died in the Holocaust came from Ukraine or had some relation to Ukraine. And now we are again in a situation of attempts to annihilate a country, nation, culture, identity. And that's again, for someone like myself, like a historian, it's also not just a emotional shock and tragedy, but it's also a sort of an intellectual disappointment, because somehow you believe that we as humankind learn from what happened in the past. And what happens today in Ukraine tells us that maybe some of us learn, others don't learn at all, or learn completely wrong lessons. And I guess that's the task, first of all, of people writing history and talking about history. We have to work harder.
Well, let me follow up with you before I turn to Metropolitan Borys. Why is it that Ukraine has had such a bloody history, as you just pointed out? The 1930s, the 1940s saw appalling, organized, lethal violence on the territory of Ukraine. You and I have spent years of our lives puzzling over this question. When I wrote The War of the World, the way I put it was, if you look at 20th century violence, an incredible proportion of it took place in an approximate triangle between the Baltic, the Balkans, and the Black Sea. Therefore, a very large amount of the organized lethal violence of the 20th century happened in Ukraine. Whereas comparatively little of it happened in North America. And now here we are, sitting in a building which houses shocking, unforgettable images of organized lethal violence that happened in the past 11 months. Do you find yourself feeling that Ukraine is in some kind of historical doom loop? Why does this keep happening? And why has it proved impossible, apparently impossible, to learn from history, to avoid this terrible thing repeating itself. I remember reading about Raphael Lemkin when Samantha Power published A Problem from Hell. I saw Samantha wandering around the Congress Center earlier this week, and that was where I first encountered Lemkin's contribution. The theme of that book was never again, because it was happening in Bosnia at that time. And here we are, years later, and we seem to have made no great progress in Eastern Europe. Why do you think that is? Do you have an answer to the question of this recurrent cycle of violence?
Well, Neil, I have an answer, and it will be probably interesting for the audience. It will be disappointing for you. The answer comes very much from your book, because if you still remember what you were writing there was that World War II, the most of the violence was taking place in Eastern Europe and in China. And the argument, if I understood it correctly, was about the geopolitical vacuum, the disintegration of the empires and the creation, the crisis of the Chinese empire and disintegration of the empires in Eastern Europe. So the rise of very weak states that were trying also to bite more than they can chew in terms of minorities, and the revanchism of the old powers that were fighting over those territories, which comes to the fight between historic Russia, which became the Soviet Union, and Germany. That's the battleground. Now, if one believes in what you wrote, what that means, why Ukraine is in this predicament, and again, all of these three cases, again, the Holocaust, the Holodomor, and the current genocide or genocidal actions are taking place to a different degree within the context of the war. Because Holodomor is basically the result of the war fought by the Ukrainian states and the war that was lost to the Russian Empire. The World War II and Holocaust, again, that's obvious. And today we are talking about the war as well. So war and genocide in different variations come together. And what you need for that not to happen, and what you need to change the predicament, not just of Ukraine, the predicament of the region, because the argument here is, okay, if Ukraine would fall, the next would be Eastern Europe, right? So it's not just about Ukraine. So the way to get out of there is actually a strong national solidarity, national identity, strong state that is able actually to defend itself. The situation in which what you described as the vacuum, power vacuum, would not exist in Ukraine. And what I see, again, I ended the response to the first question with disappointment on many levels. What I see in terms of silver lining and some hope is that what is happening in Ukraine is the formation of a particular nation and particular type of community and statehood that is not allowing and will not allow in vacuum, geopolitical vacuum, to be centered in that country or in that region.
It's a fascinating argument that in the end, this attempt at the destruction of Ukraine as a state and as a culture is going to backfire completely. Absolutely. Because Ukraine appears to me to have been fully born as a nation in the past 11 months. And we see for the first time the prospect of a strong Ukrainian state, which clearly was not firmly established after 1991. It astounded me to hear Henry Kissinger in December make the argument, which he subsequently published in The Spectator, that Ukraine would emerge from the war as a strong power, one of the strongest powers of Central and Eastern Europe. So this could be one of the most unintended consequences in the history of Russian aggression. Let me turn to the moral dimension here, Metropolitan Borys, if I may. It seems to me that genocide is to be understood partly in moral terms, because to commit an act of genocide is surely to commit an immoral and sinful act, and that the regimes in history which have carried out genocide have, I think, without exception, been atheistical regimes committed in some way or another to a non-Christian ideology. Am I right in thinking of genocide as a kind of crime against morality as well as a crime against humanity?
Partly so, you're right. Leaving powers and groups engaged in genocide. Behavior. Rwanda with Catholics against Catholics. I think to say that although through the Turkish genocide of Armenians was conducted by a secularist,
right,
atheist, different story. Genocide happens when there are victims. That's one possibility.
I think we're having a little trouble hearing the Metropolitan. Is his microphone working? I can hear you, but I suspect people at the back are struggling. Let's switch to the handheld.
Yeah.
Apologies.
So there are various kinds of political circumstances in one, second, or third other case that condition a genocide. What is always present is the desire of a group to conquer, dominate, and maybe destroy and eliminate another group. So one way of not having genocide is working to make sure that this kind of destructive and, as you said, sinful intention is somehow obviated, somehow prevented. Ukraine has had neighbors in distant history, but particularly in recent history, that have considered it their prerogative, their right to own Ukraine, to dominate Ukraine, and to do so in such a way that enhances their national identity, glory, economic, political, military power, whether it was the Nazis or the Soviets, as cases in point. What has happened, the vacuum of empires has been replaced by nation states. So the Ottoman Empire fell apart, the Austrian Empire fell apart, the French, Belgian colonial systems fell apart, the German Reich failed, and finally the English Empire fell apart. What did not fall apart is the Russian Empire. It partially splintered. 15 countries emerged in 1991. And this is a big problem for Putin. It's the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. Somewhere, at least subconsciously, somewhere in that logic, there is a clarity that if Russia falls apart more completely as an empire, it will not be able to conquer. In my earlier intervention, I shared just the basic biblical truth that sin is basically a grab. Adam grabs for something that when God is giving. And it's so much better when we can live in a polity, in a society, in a culture as mutual givers. And I think there's a beauty in the post-World War II lessons that have been applied, not always perfectly, but with much peaceful consequence in Europe, in this country, in the European Union. I don't know that there's much nostalgia in the United Kingdom for empire. I think a young Brit today would be aghast at the idea of enslaving the Irish.
It's interesting you say that, because the New York Times loves to argue that there is nostalgia for empire in Britain. It's one of the ways in which they've covered Brexit for the last 6 years. And it's not true. You're quite right. There is almost no nostalgia and a great deal of hostility to empire. You'll find many, many more negative portrayals of the British Empire on television, on the BBC, than positive. So for me, Britain is a country that has overcome that imperial legacy. I don't think that's true of Russia.
No, it isn't, of course. It always helps to construct kind of analogies. Can we imagine Brits today saying, yes, we have to dominate not only Ireland, but India. It's good to have, Australia, Canada. It's good to have an empire that the sun never sets on. And if necessary, we're going to wipe out whole populations to maintain that. Because that is exactly what is happening right now. And there's a deep pathology, not only in the head of Putin, not only in the KGB structure that is kind of the continuation of the Soviet legacy, but it's deep in Russian culture. I mean, many Russians find it difficult to accept Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian national purpose. 700 university rectors signed a letter of support of this war. Nobody in the Russian Orthodox Church at the level of leadership is speaking out against the war, and Patriarch Kirill is distorting theology, justifying what is going on in Ukraine. What is going on in Ukraine? There's genocidal aspects, because Putin has been very clear. There really was no Ukraine. It's kind of a fake. What exists now is pathetic. It's a failed state, failed nation, a failed culture.
This was the argument of his essay that he published last year on the historical unity.
Essay, and it was reiterated in a violent, vulgar way on Monday before the invasion on Thursday in February. And so Timothy Snyder has, spoken about this and written very eloquently that you can annihilate when you dehumanize.
Yeah.
So what has been the Ukrainians are Nazis. And this is an achievement of anti-genocidal activism. Nazism is maybe the one taboo that globally is condemned. Almost nothing else is like it. You can't get anywhere as a Nazi. In the West, in the East, a Nazi is a monster. And if you are a Nazi, you're a monster, and killing you is not a problem. It's actually a mission. And we see that what happened in the occupied territories, in Bucha, in Irpin, what happened in Mariupol, a city that is, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, Serhii, maybe the most Russian-speaking city in Ukraine.
Over 40% ethnic Russians before the war.
Before the war. And in terms of linguistic culture, predominantly Russian. So what do you do to save Russian speakers in Ukraine? You kill the Russian speakers in Mariupol. What is the reason? We have to reconstitute empire. And where did that Russian world idea come from? It actually came from Patriarch Kirill, who in the 2000s formulated this idea of Russian world. Wherever the Russian Orthodox Church had a presence in history, in imperial history, this is our canonical territory. This is our cultural hegemony. It is one Russian world. And this became a convenient ideological construct taken over by Putin. And it is being used now to justify genocide. And it is tragic for the Christian presence in Russia, for the Russian Orthodox Church, that the church is engaged in this ideological construct.
And this reminds us that although there were clearly anti-Christian elements in National Socialism, particularly amongst the most radical Nazis, the evangelical Lutheran Church did and was complicit in the Third Reich. So we shouldn't entirely be surprised at this conjunction. You've hit on a very, very important point, which I was hoping someone would make, that you have to dehumanize your targets before genocide is possible. The perpetrators have somehow to believe that they are not dealing with fellow humans. And this is one of the most striking features of the genocides of the 20th century. In all of the different settings, one finds a language calculated to dehumanize. This was, of course, what the Nazis did to the Jews, but it was not only done to the Jews. So let me turn back to you. One of the paradoxes that I remember exploring in the War of the World, yes, it was a long time ago, but I just about remember, was that genocides can emerge in societies that seem to be quite ethnically mixed. And for me, the great and shocking realization was that levels of intermarriage between Germans and Jews were at a very high level in the 1920s. That in fact, the Jews were more integrated into Germany than they were into many other European countries on the eve of Hitler's coming to power. When one turns to contemporary Ukraine, it's often been observed that there was a considerable mixing of Russian and Ukrainian identity. Anecdote, I'm getting my hair cut in London by a Slovakian barber who complains about Ukrainian refugees in Slovakia in the following way. As far as my father is concerned, they're just Russians. They're just the people who did it to us in 1968. So from a Slovakian point of view, it's not even clear that there is a difference between Russians and Ukrainians. You have studied this more deeply than anyone I know. Help us understand the relationship between Ukrainian and Russian identity, and then to explain how this process could come about, that Russian soldiers could go into Bucha and conduct this hideous massacre. I've been watching the videos, footage of what was done, and I still find myself asking the question, how can they be doing this to people who are really basically the same as them? Is this a story of the narcissism of small differences, that the differences are actually trivial and yet become the basis for violence? How do we think about this phenomenon that genocide can arise from apparently integrated societies?
Well, again, we talked about that. The idea, the justification of the war is Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people. So that means not that Russians are really Ukrainians, that means that Ukrainians are really Russians. They don't have right to exist. But still, you're going theoretically to liberate your own people. And that's deep belief. It's not just pretense, because on that belief is based the entire military operation. With the idea that everyone will be welcoming you with flowers. There is a number of nationalist battalions that would continue resistance, but again, that's another 10 days. And then how you turn from going and liberating your own people into committing this atrocious acts, and dehumanization, which again achieved through the use of the Nazi and Nazi terminology, and again Metropolitan Borys talked about that. But there is also one more layer to that. Putin comes to Ukraine with the idea that language equals culture. That culture equals basically your loyalty, your state loyalty. So if you speak Russian, you are Russian, and if you are Russian, your loyalty is to Mother Russia. And he faces in Ukraine a reality in which Ukraine survived in 2014, 2015, and surviving today and fighting back by crossing these linguistic and ethnic and religious lines. This is a different form of nation and national identity, completely in opposite to the idea that language defines who you are. And Natalia Homeniuk probably somewhere in the room, but again, I learned that from her, and then I found that more and more in the interviews conducted by other journalists. Very often when people in Ukraine on the front lines or in the rear are just asked what you're fighting for, define what is Ukraine, the word that comes to the fore is freedom. And it's not just a value, it's not just a general abstract, it's an everyday life that, and your freedom is taken away from you. So it's a very different model of Ukrainian nation that actually also is being formed by the war. Formation started earlier, formed by the war, and that will certainly survive and emerge victorious. And just one comment on the Russian Orthodox Church. The first, at least recorded case that I know of Putin saying about Russians and Ukrainians and so on and the same people comes from the summer of 2013, when he, together with Patriarch Kirill, comes to Kiev, and this is done all at the conference arranged for him, it seems to me, at the Kiev's monastery. So that's a direct connection between the Russian world, the idea of one indivisible Russian nation with the Great Russians, Little Russians, and White Russians. And one of the reasons for that is that this ideology is actually not just imperialist, it is imperial in its origins. That's the view of Russia pre-1917. And the Russian Orthodox Church is the only institution that survived through the Soviet period without actually formally admitting that Ukrainians do exist as a nation. Even party was organized according to there was the Communist Party of Ukraine, part of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, but the church itself, it stayed to be Ruskaya Pravoslavnaya Tserkev. So from that point of view, this imperial model, imperial metrics that the church preserved in itself now serves as a foundation, justification, legitimization of a genocide. Because if anyone seriously believes in what Putin is saying, and part of Russians believe that, okay, Russians and Ukrainians are one of the same people, you are committing genocide against your own nation.
And this is one of the paradoxes of the entire enterprise. One thing that I think we should talk about, and let me put this to you, Metropolitan Borys, is Ukraine's own history in connection with the Holocaust. One of the things that has most impressed me about contemporary Ukraine has been the effort to come to terms with the reality of the Holocaust, because it was not only carried out on part on Ukrainian territory, but Ukrainians were also involved in as perpetrators. Do you think contemporary Ukrainians have come to terms with the part that some Ukrainians played in the Holocaust? Because that coming to terms with the past seems to me an extremely important part of the process of modernization. One comes to the ideal of liberty and democracy, but one also comes to terms with the past. Do you think that has happened in Ukraine? I think of the work that Viktor Pinchuk has done on the Babi Yar memorial, a hugely impressive achievement. The fact that the president of Ukraine is himself Jewish is the kind of thing that would have seemed unimaginable in the 1940s. Do you think ordinary Ukrainians have come to terms with that part of their history?
I think the coming to terms with all parts of history is still an ongoing process, because history was hermetically sealed, at least large topics and themes. I think there's great progress. The most important progress is the decrease in anti-Semitism. Jews in Ukraine, international observers, I think universally acknowledge a rather low level of anti-Semitism in Ukraine. In fact, right now in the United States, there's a real uptick in many other countries.
Yes.
President Zelensky, as a Jewish Ukrainian, was not only elected, he was elected with a 73% majority. His Jewish identity was not a concern.
Yeah.
It was not neither, a positive nor a negative. He was viewed as a Ukrainian and as a person. I think working with students, working with politicians, working with business for decades in Ukraine, I think the traumas of Ukrainian history have not fully been dealt with. They're not fully identified. You can gauge it, I think, by the level of trust. Everybody will comment that in the past there has been a great deficit of trust in Ukrainian society. Why is that? My belief is that the genocidal waves, the violence, whether it's Russian against Ukrainians, Poles against Ukrainians, and vice versa, anti-Semitic violence, all of that, when it surrounds a person, when over multiple generations, there is systemic violence that kills systematically, it is natural and healthy to develop defense mechanisms. A mask, a facade, a wall, different barriers between you and the other, because the other is dangerous. Particularly from the Stasi archives, we know that many wives and husbands were reporting on each other. We know the cases from the Politburo, where the husband was a member and the wife was in the gulag. The mistrust, the fear, I think, in post-totalitarian, post-genocidal societies is very deep. And I think it is one of the main issues blocking real flourishing of 2 billion people that live between Estonia and Albania and China and Vietnam. It has to be named. Until very recently in the Donbass, there was a large percentage, maybe you can name it, of people that denied the Holodomor, denied their own genocide. I think war is a great accelerator. And I think this war will accelerate these processes. And I think the solidarity of a political nation is becoming ever stronger. The acceptance, the pride in a Jewish president will affect the understanding of the Holocaust. Because what is difficult, I think, for perpetrators, it's a very shameful thing to be descendants of perpetrators. And when your identity is assailed, when your identity is not buffeted, guaranteed, protected, for example, by a state, by a normal functioning of your culture, any acknowledgement of weakness becomes more difficult. Any acknowledgement of a shameful moment or process or trend in your historical past is is something you do with great difficulty.
And that, of course, explains why a characteristic feature of Putin's regime is to shut down historical inquiry into the genocidal or democidal policies of the Stalinist regime, the closing down of Memorial as an example. I'm conscious that we have 20 minutes time left, and what I'd like to do is give our audience a chance to ask questions. I'm hoping there's a roving microphone so that the questions can be clearly heard at the back. There is, it's just coming. I think the first hand that went up was down here on the front row, and then I saw a gentleman right at the back who could be next, please.
Hello. Thank you for such an interesting and insightful discussion. My name is Serhii Plokhii. I wanted to ask, all of you, if I may, about the Russian Church, which calls itself, for some reason, the Ukrainian Church of Moscow Patriarchy in Ukraine. And obviously, there was a historic event, which was the service being held in Lavra for the first time, since independence. And there are like various views on how that should be dealt with. Yeah, so certain people think, okay, this is a separate. You don't want to go into that area, as a state to basically command and try to kind of figure out what to do with the church. Yeah, so leave it alone, and it will kind of resolve itself. Other people are saying this is the best time, the perfect time actually now to go and do something about it, because this is an influence basically of a foreign and of actually the aggressor state, which has a very big impact on your country. So I was wondering how are you looking at what would be your views on that, and what could or should be done, if anything, with this particular issue. Thank you.
Well, I'm confident that Metropolitan Borys has a view on that, so perhaps he should go first, and then I'm
shared some views that he definitely has views, I think, as well.
I'm sure he does too.
This is probably the first time that I'm trying to articulate them, so it maybe I will have to edit the transcript, but I think His Beatitude Sviatoslav Shevchuk very recently in these days, I haven't seen the text, but somebody reported to me, said, we need to, the state, the society needs to be careful that outlawing the Moscow Patriarchate jurisdiction of Ukrainian Orthodoxy will probably make a martyr of that church. And I think there's an important insight in that. Serhii, I don't want to use your ammunition, but I would, attribute it to Serhii in our conversation. He was saying, some of this rhetoric around this is eerily analogous to the rhetoric used in the liquidation of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in 1946. That being said, during war, it is inconceivable to not react at examples of collaboration with the aggressor nation. And there are many examples, and there is not only examples of, let's say, informational collaboration or even tactical collaboration, but there is this ideological expression of the Russian world, of the Russian imperial, let's say, ideology that has been characteristic of an important part of the life of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. And it's clear that that kind of rhetoric, that kind of ideology leads to death. It leads to destruction. It leads to genocide. So anything that leads to genocide needs to be dealt with. How to do this is a very careful matter. It needs to be dealt with immediately. It probably needs to be dealt progressively. It needs to be done in a legal way, because the whole Ukrainian struggle and its international validity is based on defending international law, defending human rights. So I'm just mentioning principles now, not strategies or tactics. There is a big problem. It needs to be recognized. There are many members of the Moscow Patriarchate jurisdiction in Ukraine are recognizing it, and they are voting with their feet. They are leaving that jurisdiction, whether they're going to the street church down the street, because many people who say they're Orthodox, for example, Lukashenko, are not necessarily practicing Orthodox, as it is with many confessions globally. So some are going to the other jurisdiction, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is gaining social, let's say, adhesion and popularity. Others are just declaring, I don't support this church. I support the church that is separate from Moscow. This whole process that is so accelerated by war will take time also after war. And it's important to see what things can be done with a flick of a switch, from on to off, from plus to minus. What things are almost metallic, that they can be bent, maybe broken. And what things are of the heart, of the spirit. What things are deep inside people. And those type of things can only be changed through a patient process, through a process that is, in the end, very, very large-hearted, very noble, and really based on the truth, on rights, on values.
Serhii, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes. There is war going on, right? And war started back in 2014. And there is a church in Ukraine, in terms of the parishes, probably the largest religious organization in Ukraine, that is under the jurisdiction of a religious leader who is basically a strong supporter of the war and provides ideology for that war. And there is enormous pressure on that church to take a position. And I see that issue being defined on three levels. One level is the state. And the state is there to basically assure the security of the citizens and look into the issues of individuals working or not working in favor of the aggressor. And whether this individual is a bishop or priest in this jurisdiction or that jurisdiction, it doesn't matter. Whether this individual is the member of the Ukrainian security service who is caring about security of another country. Again, from that point of view, there is no difference. There are citizens of Ukraine and there is the state, and that's the relation between the state and individual members of the church. Another level is society. Ukraine survived in 2014. It fights today because of this very close link and cooperation. Ukrainian society discovered the state and state instruments and state institutions as an important way of protect itself, and the state discovered the society, and they work together. And the role of society to decide whether this is the sort of the jurisdiction that you want to belong to. It's not the role of the state, despite the fact that they work closely together, and that's the role of society. And it's not through legal measures, administrative measures, or any other measures. That's where people want to belong. They have the right to belong to those churches. That's also one of the elements what the war is waged for. And then finally, the church, the issue of the church itself and its relationship to the Moscow Patriarchate and the position that it takes or doesn't take, which of course will have a major influence on the relationship between the church and society. So I would basically here very clearly distinguish between, define not just the role of the state, but also the limits of that role. But also I think that the society has the decisive role, the most important role in defining what will be happening with that church, and the church will have either respond to that societal challenge, or probably would be really going from the at least in the number of the parishes, the largest organization, going to being completely marginalized.
Thanks. Let me take another question.
By the way, I didn't need it.
Let me
Thank you.
Let me go to the back. Gentleman in the three-piece suit is next. We actually have now quite a few questions, and what I'm going to suggest, because we have 9 minutes left, is very brief. We'll take 4 quick questions, one after the other, and then we'll try to wrap this. Otherwise, we're never going to get through many questions. Please go ahead.
I'll be very brief. My name is Dimitri Shishlo. I'm vice chairman of Ukro-Exim Bank. Interestingly, last year I had a INSEAD reunion in Fontainebleau in July, and of course we were discussing Ukraine with my fellow INSEAD cohort, and we were discussing the arguments provided by the Russian Federation against the Ukrainians, saying that they're Nazis, so we are fighting the Nazis. But that's the narrative. What I wanted to say is that the narrative that is broadcasted to the European audience. Because one of my fellow from the INSEAD, Adnan Klasnik, told me, and he lives in Qatar, so he lives in the Middle East, and he told me, you know, in the Qatar, in the Middle East, it's the opposite. The Russian propaganda puts the accent on the Jews. So the Jews are the culprits of this war, and those are the one who are being fought by the Russian Federation, because of course the president of Ukraine is a Jew, and he's let's say supported by Soros and etc. So I mean the let's say the vicious narratives of the Russian is also adapting to the audience. So whatever the Ukrainians are doing, they're always the culprits. They're either Nazis or they are Jews. So they're absolute evil, either for the let's say for the Western the part of Europe.
Can I press you to come to a question just because? It's
just the remark. I mean, we were saying that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Let me go to the gentleman in the middle of the second row, and then there's an eager lady behind him on what looks to me like the fourth or fifth row. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the presentation, for the speech. I'm Rostik. I'm the student of Geneva Business School, and since the war started, a lot of people have switched from Russian to Ukrainian, but alongside with this positive change, a great rivalry came in between the Russian-speaking groups and Ukrainian-speaking groups, and in general between the people. Some of them assuming that we should let them speak the language they have chosen to speak. Some of them assuming that it can be done only by positive step-by-step propaganda, by educating people and explaining what it really matters. And some of them are having a really aggressive position. So my question is, what is your own thoughts, how, when, and if it even be possible to be done in Ukraine? Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. So how do you deal with the different languages in a post-war Ukraine? The lady in the dress in the fourth row is next.
Hello, thank you for a very informative panel. Is it all right? Kate, futurist at Kate Goes Tech. Well, first of all, I think the title of the talk would be better suited to be called Genocide in Russia's History. And the question is, unfortunately, there are so many genocides that we know of, being in Pol Pot regime, Rwanda, Balkans, but it looks to me that in Russia specifically, it is a tool that is being used consistently in their history.
throughout Soviet regimes previously as a tactic of government building, probably state building. Is there something about Russian character or Russian identity that is prone to these genocides, in your opinion?
Thank you. And we'll take one final question from the lady on the front row.
Thank you very much for opportunity to ask one question, but I hope it's a very deep question. So you highlighted the topic about genocide and history. And this is an answer what is going on now, because genocide against Ukrainians is an ongoing process for centuries. And Serhii Plokhii knows about that very well. My family has 4 generations of people which were suffering because of Moscow. And it doesn't matter what was the name of that state. And when we are talking about future, because we have to think about future, we have to promote the idea about Russia, not only about Ukraine. And the question is about sustainable peace, because post-Putin, Russia will not solve the problem, because we will have new system in Moscow which will ongoing genocide about Ukrainians, and it will have different forms. But all of them will be against Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian choice to be a part of Western world or something like that. So my question is how to promote the idea about sustainable peace and do not think just about ad hoc needs to survive today, because it's not only about us and winning on the battlefield. It's about future of Russia. And I believe that Ukrainians and big alliance of thinkers and good people of will all over the world is to be a part of building the strategy about sustainable peace for future generation. My son has 11 years old. My husband is in Ukrainian army. My grandparents spent 20 years in prisons during USSR, and if this war will ongoing for 8 years, my son will be a part of of defense system in the future. So my question is to you: how to stop ongoing genocide, which happening with us for centuries?
Well, we have 3 questions, which in some ways are quite closely related, and 3 minutes, so this is not going to be easy. Let me recap. The question of rivalry between Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers, which the questioner thinks has been exacerbated. The question of the historic tendency of Russian regimes, whether imperial or communist, to engage in genocide. And finally, what can we do to change that if indeed there is such a recurrent tendency? Metropolitan Borys, why don't you go first? We're going to have to keep it very brief because people doubtless have to go to other things. But if you could perhaps offer some reflections in answer to at least one of those questions.
So we've seen incredible development of the political identity of the Ukrainian nation, or the Ukrainian nation as a political nation, and admirable harmony among citizens of Ukraine. This process in an analogous way needs to happen in Russia. So Russia needs to be cured of its imperialism. It needs to be cured of the pathological, morally, ideologically, historically, and culturally pathological, let's say, stimuli towards aggression, conquest, and genocide. It has to be cured. Now, how do you cure Russia of that? Well, we have a historical precedent. Germany had to absolutely lose the war. There had to be a Nuremberg process. Germans repented over decades. And we have a new Germany today, which is a constructive member of the European and global community. Will that happen with Russia in the same way? I don't know. I hope it does. I hope that Russia will catastrophically lose this war, and that the loss of the war will bring a reckoning, that there will be a shattering of the empire, because it's hard to lose imperial intention when you have imperial property.
Let me, because we're entirely out of time, give the last word to Serhii Plokhii. I think I want to make it a historical question. Is it true to say that Russia has perennially engaged in genocide, going beyond the 1917, going back in history, and will continue to behave that way unless there is something as dramatic as was inflicted on Germany in 1945 and subsequently?
Well, many people, including myself, believed that in 1991 history came to an end, at least in a sense that the history of the violence of war and of history of Russia as an empire came to an end, if not the victory of liberalism. And we are now 30 plus years later in clearly wake-up call. If this is not a wake-up call, I don't know what it is, that history matters. You can't change things in societies overnight and change the name of organization and declare authoritarian regime, democratic regime, and everything would be good and nice. So history matters also in this very bad way. What we see in Russian history, again, seems to be unique. It is not unique. We started our discussion talking about genocide as something that is related to the war and something that is related to the imperialism and disintegration of empires as well. And in that sense, the victory for Ukraine is automatically defeat not just for Russia, but for Russian empire as such. And to a degree that empire and genocide are connected, I would say that there would be some hope in that. But there would be no hope whatsoever, neither for Ukraine, nor for post-Soviet space or Eastern Europe, if we lose. We will not, but that's a scenario that everyone in the world has to have in mind.
Conclusion: the best cure for this recurrent pattern of genocide is a Ukrainian victory and an emphatic defeat of Putin's Russia. I think pretty much everybody in the room would agree with that. Please join me in applauding. Thank you.